and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share scary crawler encounters I came across on the internet. These stories include a young woman who had a chilling experience while walking her dog, only to have a more terrifying one later on, and a man who looked out his window one night to see a strange creature. But first, we start with a story from a man who encountered something in a national forest in Colorado and then went back out in search of this thing looking for answers. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a poster who believes he encountered a skinwalker not once but twice while he was stationed in Colorado. But based on his description of the creature, I believe what he actually encountered was a crawler. He says he had never heard of skinwalkers until he was in Colorado and used to joke about them with his friends. Well, one night he decided to take one of his friends to the San Isabel National Forest to hunt skinwalkers. The San Isabel National Forest is located in central Colorado, where it covers more than 1,120,000 acres and covers parts of 11 counties. The state of Colorado has 53 peaks that stand over 14,000 feet tall, with 19 of them located within San Isabel. It is one of 11 national forests in the state. It was approximately 9 o'clock at night when the original poster and his friend arrived at the national forest, a place he was familiar with but had only been to during the day. They drove down some of the trails deep into the forest for their cryptid hunt, but he does say here that he was only messing with his friend about hunting skinwalkers and was only there to ride the trails. However, fate had other ideas. As they reached a place where they could turn around, an eerie sensation crept over him. It was the, as he puts it, cliché feeling of being watched. He continued about his business of turning around with the backup camera of his Jeep on the entire time. It was in the camera that he noticed what looked like a human-like figure running behind his car in the distance, even though the vehicle kicked up dust as he drove. He kept quiet at first, thinking it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, but then he decided to stop the car for a moment and ask his friend if he noticed anything unusual on the camera. His friend described seeing exactly what the original poster saw. They rolled down their windows then and listened for any kind of movement around them. In the vast expanse of the 250 square mile forest, they both heard what sounded like a little boy yell, "Help." He says the voice sounded as if it belonged to a 5 or 6-year-old. Their heads snapped toward each other, and without hesitation his friend said, "Effing drive." They wasted no time tearing down the trail the way they had come, all the while catching glimpses of the creature through his camera. He says it stood as tall as his 35-inch spare tire on his lifted Jeep while running on all fours. As they reached a fork in the trail, he made the decision to turn around out of sheer curiosity. His friend, however, wasn't keen on exploring the possibility of encountering unknown creatures inhabiting the woods, but the OP says he was the one who was driving. He sat for a few minutes before his friend started groaning while covering his face. When the OP inquired about his well-being, a wave of absolute dread and sensory overload, as he puts it, hit him. He mentions here that when he was younger he dabbled in black magic and says the presence he felt out there was demonic. Tears began filling his eyes and he struggled to breathe and even speak. He decided then that it was time to leave for good. All the while, a clear humanoid figure followed them out of the woods. Later, his friend mentioned hearing a strange noise outside his window, a low gurgling sound that then escalated into a loud scream reminiscent of a howler monkey. Although the OP didn't hear anything, the overwhelming sensation he experienced in that moment was paralyzing. He later stopped for gas and discovered muddy handprints on his Jeep's rock guards and tire gate. The vehicle was cleaned before he and his friend drove out into the forest. Several weeks later, he decided to bring a group of friends along for an armed adventure, excluding the one who joined him on his initial trip. He was somewhat let down by their lack of tactical skills and weapon expertise, especially since they were all in the military, but they did agree to accompany him. This time there were 5 of them, all armed. The posse carried with them 2 rifles, a 12-gauge shotgun, and sidearms. As they drove down the familiar trail, they encountered strange occurrences like movement in the darkness, glowing red eyes, and even some distant singing. It was then that they decided to continue on foot. Almost as soon as they exited the vehicle, it began to snow, even though it was October and early for snowfall. He describes the snow as being a near whiteout. Then suddenly, about 50 meters ahead, they heard the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the trees on their right. He says to him it sounded like a moose. A little ways off the trail, one of the group members stumbled upon a little stick teepee. There were also odd bundles of sticks tied to the branches of trees. Despite all of this, they decided to press on. The lone skeptic of the group, who doubted the existence of these creatures, forged ahead of everyone else with only his 12 gauge and no flashlight. When the OP once again heard movement in the woods, he gathered everyone in a circle in case a bull moose charged them. His friend, who went ahead into the darkness alone without a flashlight, then started shouting for someone to shine a light in the direction he was aiming his gun. Urging everyone else to retreat immediately, he never once lowered his weapon. The OP kept a close eye on their surroundings as he guided his friend back to them, preparing for a possible confrontation as they heard noises and something running through the trees around them, circling them from seemingly every direction. The group was eventually able to make their way out of the forest, and as they returned to the Jeep, his friend, who went ahead alone, shared with him what he saw. He described a large skinny creature with a pale complexion and scraggly hair on top of its head. It was sitting motionless on the trail ahead of them, and at first he mistook this thing for a log until it turned its head and looked at him. Before they left, they caught faint echoes of eerie screams emanating from the depths of the forest. After these initial encounters, he ventured back out to the forest a few more times with similar groups that were armed and ready. However, besides the familiar noises and the occasional sound of jingling chains, the only responses they received when whistling would be return whistles from within the nearby woods. At the time of his post, he was living in Florida and was eager to continue his research there. He's heard of rumors of encounters in the state and is hopeful to find something. He ends his post by asking anyone who comes across his story to share any insights or experiences with him. I'll start off by saying that some of the techniques used by the creature in this story could be attributed to a skinwalker and even a wendigo, given that both are skilled, if not experts, at mimicry. But crawlers are said to be expert mimics as well, and given the description of the creature encountered in the San Isabel National Forest, I believe this was a crawler. They, like many other cryptids, are said to be very fast when running, fast enough to keep up with cars. That, and they are said to be extremely skinny, pale humanoids. There's a bit of a misconception when it comes to skinwalkers in that people see crawlers and think they are witnessing a skinwalker, but I've never heard of a skinwalker story where they are described as looking like this. Actually, they are usually seen in their animal forms exhibiting bizarre behavior for animals, which leads people to believe they are skinwalkers instead. But going back to the creature in this story, the description fits perfectly for a crawler, even with the scraggly bit of hair atop its head. Crawlers are usually described as being completely hairless, but this isn't the first story where I've heard of one having at least a little bit of hair on top of its head. Another thing I want to mention about this story is how the OP keeps going out in search of these creatures. I always strongly advise against this because you don't want them to take an interest in you. That's when you could possibly start attracting them or other creatures like them, and they could even follow you home. This is called the hitchhiker effect, and it happens a lot, especially when people go out in search of them time and time again. It happens to a lot of Sasquatch so-called hunters who go out into the woods knocking on trees and hooting and hollering. You are also putting yourself in harm's way when you go out looking for something like this, especially with a crawler. They are usually described as way more sinister than any other type of cryptid and seem to have ill intent. The OP of this story even said that the presence out there felt demonic to him. This is very common in crawler stories. It's not a good idea to provoke them whether you do so intentionally or not. And I know the OP and his friends are armed when they go out hunting for these things, but from all accounts I've heard, guns are of very little use against cryptids. I just hope the OP either loses interest in seeking these things out or decides against it for his own safety. The last thing I want to mention about this story is the strong sensory overload he and his friend experienced during their first encounter. This is common in cryptid encounters and just points to the fact that they have the ability to mess with our senses and our heads. It adds credence to the theory that they are at least part supernatural or have supernatural abilities. What do you think about this one? Would you have the urge to go back out to a location after having a cryptid encounter there? The next story comes from a poster who took to the internet to share their encounter in hopes of finding answers about what they had the misfortune of coming across in February of 2019. Her story takes place in the Pacific Northwest, in the mountains a few hours away from Seattle to be more specific. She starts off by saying that she very rarely ever drinks, but she does eat medicinal marijuana and CBD for some chronic illnesses. However, she makes a point of saying that she knows the difference between a bad high and real life, and that she was completely sober for each encounter. The town where she lives is a small logging and mining town with numerous quarries, abandoned mines, caves, and old small abandoned towns scattered throughout the mountains. Her neighborhood is surrounded by woods with a river flowing through most of the backyards. It was approximately 10 at night when she had her first encounter with this creature. She was out walking her dog on a curvy road in her neighborhood she describes as being thin. She had music playing and eventually sped up from a walk to a slow jog, but got no further than half a mile away from her home when she came around a sharp turn in the paved road and her dog's behavior suddenly changed. He slowed down and displayed an unmistakable change in body language. He stood there refusing to go forward, with his gaze fixed on a dark cluster of pine and maple trees located on one of the larger properties in the neighborhood that was fenced off. Following her dog's eyes, she tried to look where he was looking, through a metal fence and into the shadows beyond. This is where she saw a small forested area that had a creek and a sizable pond. However, her attention was abruptly drawn to a figure eerily resembling a human standing beneath the trees, right in front of the fence. A wave of dread washed over her then, causing the hairs on the back of her neck to stand on end. She says here that everything about the situation felt wrong, as if she had stepped into a horror movie. Without a second thought, she bolted away with her dog by her side, and she made a point not to look back. Even to this day, when she thinks about the creature's empty, hollow eyes, it fills her with dread. She goes on to say that what she saw that night was no bear, wolf, coyote, or mountain lion, and it definitely was not human. The creature was standing on all fours, with its elbows sticking out to its sides and with its ribs visibly showing. It had long bony fingers, a spine that visibly stuck out to the point she says it was sickening, and pinkish pale skin. There were no ears, a little bit of hair, and a face with no visible features. But she says that she definitely remembers this thing's hollow eyes. And unfortunately, she would see this thing again. A few months after her first encounter with this thing, she was alone on a walk at night. It had been a while since she had first saw the creature and was once again comfortable going back out at night. As she walked, she found herself back at the same hill where she first saw the creature. While walking along the road, she heard a woman scream that froze her in her tracks. It sounded off, she says, and that's the only way she knows how to explain it. A wave of dread once again washed over her. Within minutes, the piercing screams were replaced by a continuous crying. The source seemed to emanate from the forest very close to the road. Trying to maintain her composure, she focused on her breathing, trying not to freak out. However, she did begin to panic and sprinted up the hill with the crying sound gradually fading into the distance. But this created a problem, as she had to go back the way she had just come to get back home, which was about a quarter of a mile away. After taking a moment to compose herself, she turned and ran back down the road toward her home. The crying had ceased by the time she returned to the spot where it originated, but she kept running anyway. It was then that she sensed a presence trailing her from within the forest, darting from tree to tree. Even though she couldn't see it, she could hear something big moving through the foliage in pursuit. Unfortunately for her, she says she has bad endurance and needed to stop for a quick breather. When she finally did, she found herself back at the same spot where she had her first encounter with the creature. Her pause for a quick breather wasn't very long because she had a strong sense that this thing, whatever it was in the woods, was still following her. When she began running again, she felt like something was right on her heels with the sound of footsteps behind her, but she couldn't muster the courage needed to glance back. However, she was able to escape a second time. Her post ends with her asking if she saw a crawler or the rake. Many of the crawler stories I hear take place either near a cave system or old mines, and this story not only has both of these but also adds quarries into the mix as well. It's like a perfect storm of locales for crawlers to inhabit. I'm not surprised that the OP of this story had not just one encounter but two. I also say to pay attention to wildlife when out in the woods or your pet if you have one with you. And it's a good thing that she took notice of her dog's behavior during their first encounter. I guess it helped when the dog refused to go any further down the trail. This seems to definitely have prevented her from walking right up onto this creature unaware. There's no telling what could have happened if she had. I always say it's a shame when a cryptid encounter robs someone of something they love, such as camping, hunting, hiking, or the like. So it's a good thing that she was eventually able to go back out walking down a path she enjoys. But unfortunately, this poor girl had yet another encounter the very next time she went out. I wouldn't blame her if she didn't want to go back out there. I would, however, advise against going out at night if she does decide to venture back down that trail for a walk. Also, she mentions in an edit that whatever was following her during the second encounter was actually up in the trees jumping from tree to tree. I haven't heard of many crawler stories where they move through the trees like this, but I have heard some in which they do. This is another story that showcases a crawler's ability to mimic, as it did so by imitating a woman screaming and then a crying child. Both tactics no doubt used to try to lure someone into the woods alone. I'm just glad she was able to get out of there unharmed, and all this thing did was follow her instead of something worse. It's said not to run from these things because it prompts them to give chase, but in this instance, it worked out. What do you think about this one? Would you continue to go back out there alone at night after having two encounters in the same spot? The final story of this episode comes to us from southern British Columbia, where one poster believes he encountered a crawler one night. His encounter took place at a trailer his family owns that is situated on a cliff overlooking Lake Kootenay. The lake is located in the southern region of British Columbia, and the trailer there served as a summer getaway for the original poster and his family. The trailer sits amidst a cedar pine forest with no neighbors in sight and the closest town 15 miles away. It was around 11 p.m. on the night of his encounter, and the OP was in bed with a book, wide awake. He sleeps facing away from the window with the blinds open so the moonlight can illuminate his book, and he doesn't need to turn on any lamps in his room. As he lay there, the moonlight streaming in through the window dimmed for a moment, causing him to look outside. That's when he saw it, a large, almost luminous white creature slowly making its way through the dimly lit area. It was casting a shadow over his window, which caused the light coming through to dim. The creature had unnaturally long and spindly arms and legs with visible contours resembling emaciated ribs on its side. He says due to this thing being hunched over, it was difficult to gauge its height as it moved away, bent over, in a way he says he can only describe as crawling. Despite the overwhelming fear instilled in him by this creature, he couldn't tear his eyes away from it, no matter how badly he wanted to. The creature swiftly made its way from the front of the cabin to the trees, where it disappeared into the forest. At that moment, the OP wanted to believe what he was seeing was just a sickly, hairless bear, but he says this thing's limbs were far too long and skinny to belong to a bear. Moreover, he says he believes even a bear suffering from mange would still have patches of hair or discolored skin, unlike this creature. It was completely white and had a faint glow to it when it was in the light. The last thing I would want at night was for my window to be darkened by something and then look outside to see a creature like this. At first, I thought he was going to say it was looking in the window at him, which would have been much worse. Crawlers do like to do that though, and I've heard of a lot of stories where they look in at people. In this story, it didn't seem to take notice of him, which is a good thing. Hopefully, it was just passing through the area and it doesn't hang around. Then it may very well become interested about the home and whoever's inside. This is also not the first crawler story where someone describes them as being so white that they seem to glow in the light that hits them. There is a popular theory that they live underground and that's why their skin is so pale and sometimes even white in color. This theory is backed up by the majority of crawler stories taking place near old caves or mines. Not all, but the majority. It would make sense that their complexion is so pale due to them having no exposure to sunlight and why they are only usually seen at night. Being that the original poster of this story only saw this thing the one time, it makes me think that it was just passing through the area. I hope that's the case. What do you think about this one? What would you do if a creature like this darkened your window at night? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.